Reuben McBride, son of Daniel and Abigail Meade McBride, was born July 16, 1803, in the town of Chester, Washington, New York. His grandparents on his father's side were Samuel and Margaret McBride. On his mother's side was Gideon and Martha Meade. He was the son of a large family who were prominent in religious, civic, and national affairs. On his 30th anniversary, in 1833, he was baptized a member of the LDS Church in New York. In the spring of 1834, Joseph Smith and Parley P. Pratt went to his home and held a meeting. And at the close of the meeting, Joseph called for volunteers to go up to redeem Zion. Grandfather was the first to volunteer to go. They were to meet in Kirtland, Ohio. His brother-in-law, Vincent Knight, took him in his buggy. The prophet Joseph Smith called them together and spoke for a short time, continued by a blessing and a sealing upon each one of them. There was a branch of the church at Salt River. At the reorganization, Lyman White was chosen general. Grandfather was one of the riflemen in the company. The company now numbered 205 men. They were set apart for the work and started on their journey. The next camp was Fishing River. As soon as they camped, they were guarded. Some of the mob came and told them to get out of the road. They would catch hell before morning if they didn't. There came a terrific thunderstorm and wind blew so terrible that it took 3 or 4 men to hold down the tent. When the wind ceased, the rain came down in torrents. Brother Emerson Lyman, father of Apostle Francis Lyman, and grandfather slept together, or rather they lay down in the tent together. Thunders, lightning, rain continued until the tent was about a foot deep in water. Thus they spent the night in a watery bed. They saw no hell, but a short distance from them, large hailstones came down with such force that it cut down trees and vegetables to pieces. The mob again tried to attack. The next night cholera broke out. Some fell while standing at guard duty. Many were taken. 9 at one time were laying on the floor together. About 13 or 14 died of the dreaded disease. It was indeed a very distressing time for the missionaries. The next day they went to Lyman White's and camped while on Fishing River. Joseph received a revelation that the strength of the Lord's house had not listened to the call, and it was necessary for them for a test in their faith, and then their sacrifice was accepted, as with Abraham when he offered his son Isaac. At this period, Reuben was a very honorable missionary, and he was released under the signature of Lyman White. He was the general at that time at Liberty. Later on, Reuben was stricken with cholera, and through the ministration of Brother Lyman White and Lyman E. Johnson, he was instantly healed by the laying on of hands. Reuben was a member of the Second Quorum of 70s. He was ordained February 38, 1833 in Kirtland, Ohio, under the hands of the prophet Joseph Smith and 2 counselors, Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery. Later on, he was subpoenaed in the court to give testimony concerning the whereabouts of the prophet Joseph. Believing it was a privilege, he refused to testify. He was held for contempt of court and was committed to jail until such time he was willing to testify. After 3 to 4 days of imprisonment, he was ordered to and brought forth into the court. When the judge asked him if he was ready to testify, he answered no. The judge says, "I will keep you in jail until you signify you're willing to testify." Grandfather exclaimed, "I am a native-born citizen of the United States. My forefathers fought in the Revolution. My brothers fought in the War of 1812. I do not believe the court has legal right to demand me for this testimony, which requires, and again I refuse to give testimony. I will lay on the jail floor until the maggots carry my body through the keyhole out of the door." Uncle Reuben, as he was always called, was considered the last legally appointed custodian of the sacred edifice, the Kirtland Temple. He was the first man baptized for the dead in the font of the temple at Nauvoo. And he heard the exclamation through the lips of the prophet Joseph Smith, "Blessed is he who is first baptized for the dead in this dispensation." Later on, after visiting Utah, he returned back to Kirtland, Ohio in the fall of 1851 to gather his family and to return back to Utah in 1852. They spent some time in Farmington and Springville, and later on in 1853 he was called by the prophet Brigham Young to help settle Fillmore. He was taught at that time Fillmore would probably be the state capital. Preparations were made for the State House. Consequently, one section was erected, materials being red stone. It stands to this day as a monument of the pioneers. On April Conference 1857, Grandfather was called on a second mission, this time to England. He left home going to Salt Lake, where he and 70 other missionaries took hand carts all the way back to Florence. On their journey, they had to pass through tall mountains, snow drifts, waded streams, and go through terrific storms. Finally, they had reached Florence. Grandfather became ill, almost like the cholera. Brother Felshaw and Brother Moser laid their hands upon his head and gave him a blessing. He was healed and was able to return to his journey. After a voyage of 26 days, they landed in Liverpool. Due to the illness that Grandfather had, he was advised to go home, which he did in the company of his oldest son, Reuben McBride, who went with him. That year, Johnson's army was making its memorable trip to Utah. In 1866, his son, Reuben A., returned back to England on another mission. Reuben died February 26, 1891 in Fillmore, Utah. He was survived by his widow, Mary Anderson, whom he had 9 children. 6 of them were still alive at his death. He had 50 grandchildren and 30 great-grandchildren. He is revered by his children and grandchildren and anyone that knew him for his testimony of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Mary Ann Anderson, daughter of Lansing and Priscilla Anderson. She was born March 25, 1808, in New York. She was of Scottish descent and was a Puritan type of womanhood, a devoted saint and firm believer in the mission of the prophet Joseph Smith, with whom she was very well acquainted. She became the wife of McBride in 1830. Elder Gill was officiating. Her faith in the gospel impelled her to leave her kindred against the earnest protests and cost her lots with the unpopularity of going with this new Latter-day Saints. In New York, 1833, a baby came to gladden their home. They called her Helen. Scarcely more than a year had elapsed when little Harriet answered to the family roll call. Shortly after that, they moved to Kirtland, Ohio. Here she was left with her family much of the time, as Grandfather was considered by the church authorities as a Minuteman and did a great deal of missionary work. While at Kirtland, the following children were born: Reuben, Louisa, Roy, Emma, Newton, and Laura. In the year of 1850, Grandfather left his family and came to Utah in the company with President Brigham Young, and whose family he made in his home for the following year. Grandfather returned to Kirtland a year later and brought his family to Utah. In 1852, spending the winter in Farmington and Springville, sometime later after moving to Fillmore, they had a baby named Alice. Now Alice made the family to have 6 girls and 3 sons, all of the who grew to manhood and womanhood. They all married and raised large families who honored and revered their noble ancestors. Grandma McBride was a woman of culture and skill. She was a poet, contributing many poems to the public. For many years, she contributed to the Women's Exponent, the Relief Society magazine, which was published in Utah, each issue of which she prized very highly, keeping them filed for the future reference. She was full of benevolence and kindness to the poor, contributing much of her time and talents without solicitation or compensation. God blessed her with talent to bring and to save souls. By her kind hand, and many souls were brought into because of her work under very precious and critical conditions. God being her guide, she achieved great success. For several years, she was considered a very important lady in the area. She was a counselor in the Millard State Relief Society, and later president of the Fillmore Ward Relief Society. She was very skillful in needlecraft. As a child, I remember seeing some of her excellent work, which was sent to the state fair. Besides rearing her family of 9 children, she raised the youngest son of her daughter Laura, who died at the age 26, leaving 6 small children. Although the family did not suffer for food, as some of the early pioneers did, yet they did indulge of all the labor and incidents to the pioneer life, spinning yarn, weaving the cloth for which she made clothing for her family. I well remember a beautiful bedspread which she wove of navy blue and fine yarn. The design was a real piece of art. She would put her spinning wheel upstairs where she thought it would be safe, but on the contrary, the grandchildren would find their way to grandmother's spinning wheel and try their talent on making yarn from rolls. Grandmother's loom was an ideal hiding place for the children to seclude themselves while deeply engaged in study. Grandmother used to make a variety of dyes, which she could blend any color cloth that she wanted, which she could make quilts and rag carpets. She also made soap from hardwood ashes. Grandfather made her what they called a leach, which was composed of slats of wood, then filled with hot wood ashes and a trough or a drain. About one day, she would pour a bucket of water over the ashes. When sufficient liquid was accumulated, she would add a certain amount of grease and made soap, which served for washing and scrubbing. In the early days, the people were advised by the church authority to take an Indian child in their home and to rear and educate them. According to grandfather and grandmother, they obeyed this counsel. They took an Indian boy, whom they called Jefferson. He was granted all the privileges of those early days. A very distressing sadness came to the family when the husband of the oldest daughter, Helen Brown, whose husband Samuel and also Josiah Call, which were friends, were returning from the north when they were attacked by the Indians at Chicken Creek Hill. They were shot, and before death assumed, they were scalped, leaving their scalps hanging over their eyes. They were then hung up by their feet in a cedar tree on this side of the hill. That place has always been marked with sadness by anyone that has passed through there. Grandmother was always true to her faith. Not only did she desire the care for the living, but also for the dead. She and grandfather did much work for at the St. George Temple and the Manti Temple. After the death of grandfather, grandmother remained in the home for some time. When her health began to fail, she went to live with their youngest daughter, Mrs. Alice Collister, where she remained until her death on August the 18th, 1896 in Fillmore, Utah.